April 15th, 1823. The Fairfax Gallery glowed with the warm light of 100 candles, their flames reflecting off gilt frames and polished wooden floors, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that Clara Thornhill observed from her carefully chosen position in the shadowed corner near the draped windows. She had positioned herself here deliberately, close enough to hear the comments of the preview evening's attendees, yet far enough to remain unnoticed, a skill she had perfected over her 28 years of being perpetually overlooked. The air carried the mingled scents of beeswax, expensive French perfumes, and the faint mustiness of oil paint, a combination that would have been intoxicating had Clara allowed herself to hope. But hope was a luxury she had learned to ration with the same careful economy she applied to household expenses, since her father's death had left her and her younger sister Margaret with little more than Clara's modest artistic talent and a rented set of rooms in an unfashionable quarter of London. She watched as Lady Catherine Greville, resplendent in emerald silk, paused before Clara's landscape of a wind-swept Yorkshire moor, the painting Clara privately considered her finest work. Lady Greville tilted her head, pursed her lips, and declared to her companion in a voice that carried across the gallery, "Pleasant enough, I suppose, though one does wonder why Mrs. Fairfax continues to humour these lady artists. A hobby is all well and good, but to display their work alongside serious painters seems rather indulgent." Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that particular compression of disappointment and resignation she had come to recognize as her constant companion. She was past the age when marriage offered escape, too genteel for proper employment, and too proud to accept the kind of patronizing charity that society occasionally extended to impoverished gentlewomen. Her paintings were her livelihood, her dignity, and her voice in a world that had made abundantly clear it had little interest in what she had to say. Margaret had begged to attend tonight, but Clara had insisted her sister remain home, unwilling to subject her to the casual cruelty of London society's judgment. Around the gallery, clusters of well-dressed patrons moved from painting to painting, with the languid assessment of those for whom art was merely another arena for social display. A portly gentleman in an elaborate waistcoat chuckled at something his companion whispered while standing before Clara's smallest piece, a study of dawn light through apple blossoms. Two young ladies giggled behind their fans near her Scottish Highland scene, the one she had laboured over through the grey winter months, trying to capture the particular quality of northern light she had observed during a brief journey years ago when her family's circumstances had been more comfortable. Mrs. Fairfax, the gallery owner, caught Clara's eye from across the room and offered an encouraging smile that somehow made Clara feel even more exposed, more pitiable. Tomorrow was the auction. Tomorrow these same people would decide with their bids and their deliberate silence what value her work held. Clara allowed herself one small, dangerous wish as she stood in her corner. Let just one painting sell for enough to keep her and Margaret fed and housed through summer. The gallery door opened with a decisive sound at 9:30, admitting a figure who moved with such quiet authority that conversations faltered and resumed in altered tones as Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Ashford, entered the preview evening with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to deference but indifferent to spectacle. Clara recognized him immediately, though she had seen him only once before, 2 years past at a musicale where she had accompanied Margaret as chaperone, and he had stood near the pianoforte with an expression of genuine absorption that set him apart from the performance's merely fashionable attendees. He was tall, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, despite his 34 years, and he possessed that particular quality of stillness that suggested depth rather than reserve. Unlike the other patrons who drifted through the gallery with the leisurely assessment of those filling social obligations, Alexander moved with purpose, offering brief acknowledgments to those who greeted him, but declining to be detained in conversation. Clara watched as he passed Lady Greville with a polite nod that somehow conveyed both respect and disinterest, sidestepped a cluster of young gentlemen discussing the upcoming racing season, and came to stand before her largest work, the Scottish Highland landscape she had painted from memory and longing, depicting dawn breaking over mountains she had seen only once but had never forgotten. He stopped as though the painting had physically arrested his movement. From her shadowed corner, Clara observed the way his expression shifted, the slight forward lean of his posture, the manner in which his eyes moved across the canvas, not in the sweeping glance of casual appraisal, but in the careful examination of genuine engagement. He stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, an eternity in the rapid circulation of gallery viewing, long enough that other patrons began to notice and whisper. Clara felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest, that treacherous warmth of being seen, truly seen, even if only through her work. Then Lord Frederick Hastings materialized at the Duke's elbow, a man Clara knew by reputation as a collector of art and grievances, his expression carrying that particular smugness of those who mistake condescension for sophistication. Hastings said something Clara could not hear from her distance, but she saw Alexander's shoulders stiffen slightly, saw the cool politeness that descended over his features. Hastings gestured at her painting with a dismissive wave, and though Clara still could not distinguish words, she recognized the tone, that casual cruelty refined society wielded like a favored accessory. Her brief moment of dangerous hope contracted back into familiar resignation. Of course, whatever interest the Duke had shown would be swiftly redirected by Hastings's mockery. Clara prepared herself to watch Alexander move away, to join the consensus that her work was pleasant enough but ultimately forgettable, the artistic equivalent of her own social standing. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. But Alexander did not move away. Instead, he turned to face Lord Hastings with a composure that somehow conveyed both courtesy and absolute dismissal. And though Clara remained too distant to hear every word, she caught fragments carried across the gallery's acoustics, the Duke's voice low but clear as he said something about technical mastery and emotional resonance, about the particular difficulty of capturing light at that hour, about how this work demonstrated a sophistication that many more celebrated artists never achieved in their entire careers. Hastings laughed, a sharp sound designed to invite others into his mockery, and Clara saw him gesture broadly at the painting, while saying something that made several nearby patrons glance uncomfortably away. Alexander's response was quieter, requiring Hastings to lean in to hear it, but whatever the Duke said caused the other man's face to flush with irritation. Hastings straightened, adjusted his cravat with unnecessary force, and declared in a voice pitched to carry, "Well, we shall see what the bidding reveals tomorrow, shall we not? I intend to acquire several pieces for my new estate, and I trust my judgment against anyone's, even yours, Ashford." The Duke inclined his head with polite acknowledgement, but made no verbal response, turning his attention back to Clara's painting, as though Hastings had already ceased to exist. The dismissal was so complete, so effortlessly executed, that Clara felt a flutter of something between admiration and terror. Hastings lingered a moment longer, clearly hoping to provoke further engagement, then retreated with visible annoyance to join a group near the gallery's entrance. Clara pressed herself further into her corner, heart hammering with the dangerous hope she had promised herself to suppress, trying to maintain the careful equilibrium between possibility and protection that had become her constant negotiation with the world. She watched Alexander remain before her painting for several more minutes, watched the way his eyes traced the progression of light across the painted mountains, the way his expression held something she recognized because she had felt it herself while creating the work, that peculiar ache of beauty mixed with loss, of loving something you can only hold in memory and representation. Then Mrs. Fairfax appeared at Clara's elbow with such sudden proximity that Clara startled, pressing one hand to her chest. The gallery owner smiled with warm conspiracy, her voice low as she said, "My dear, I have hosted exhibitions for 15 years, and I have never seen the Duke of Ashford spend so long studying a single work, nor defend it with such conviction." Clara managed to whisper, "Lord Hastings seemed quite determined to discourage his interest." Mrs. Fairfax made a small, dismissive sound, waving one gloved hand as though brushing away an inconvenient insect. "Lord Hastings collects art the way he collects everything else, as a demonstration of his wealth and taste. But the Duke, the Duke actually sees what he looks at. Do you understand the difference?" Clara was not certain she dared understand it, dared believe that her work might truly move someone of such refinement and position. Mrs. Fairfax continued, her expression growing more serious. "He is known for impeccable judgment and for generous purchases when something genuinely captures his attention. I have cautious optimism about tomorrow's auction, my dear, cautious but real optimism." The morning of April 16th arrived with unseasonable chill, a grey sky that seemed to press down upon London with atmospheric weight that matched the tightness in Clara's chest as she and Margaret made their way to Fairfax Gallery for the auction scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock. Clara had slept poorly, her mind cycling through possibilities she knew better than to entertain, and she had changed her dress 3 times before Margaret had gently but firmly insisted on the deep blue muslin that brought out the colour of her eyes. Not that anyone would be looking at her eyes when they could be examining her work, with whatever mixture of appreciation or dismissal they chose to bring. The gallery was already crowded when they arrived at 1:15, the chairs arranged in neat rows before the raised platform where the auctioneer would stand, and Clara felt her stomach clench at the sight of so many fashionable attendees, the cream of London society come to acquire art and gossip in equal measure. Margaret guided her to seats in the very back row, a location that offered both the refuge of relative invisibility and the torment of clear sightlines to all the attendees who mattered. Lady Catherine Greville held court in the 3rd row, surrounded by other matrons whose ostrich plumes bobbed with the vigour of their conversation, and Clara did not need to hear the words to know their subject when Lady Greville glanced back toward where she and Margaret sat, her expression carrying that particular satisfaction of those who find entertainment in others' presumption. Margaret leaned close to whisper, "Pay her no mind, Clara, she has never created anything in her life beyond malicious commentary." But Clara felt the familiar shame creep up her neck nonetheless, the sense that her presence here was somehow inappropriate, that by offering her work for public sale, she had committed some breach of feminine modesty that Lady Greville and her ilk would never forgive. The auction began promptly at 2, the auctioneer a thin man with a reedy voice that nonetheless carried authority as he explained the terms and invited examination of the catalogue. The first several lots were works by established artists, landscapes and portraits that sold briskly for amounts that made Clara's head spin, hundreds of pounds exchanging hands with casual rapidity. Then came pieces by less prominent painters, and Clara watched the enthusiasm in the room diminish perceptibly, bids coming slower and settling at more modest sums. Her first painting was Lot number 17, a view of the Thames at sunset that she had laboured over for 3 weeks the previous autumn, trying to capture that particular quality of light that turned the water to hammered gold. The auctioneer announced it with professional neutrality, Miss Clara Thornhill, Thames at sunset, oil on canvas, and Clara felt Margaret's hand find hers beneath the cover of their skirts. The room settled into expectant quiet, the particular silence of waiting to see whether anyone valued a thing enough to claim it. Then from the front row came a voice of quiet authority that Clara recognized immediately. Alexander Pembroke speaking clearly. £200. The sum struck Clara like a physical blow. £200 for a single painting, more than she had earned in total from all her work over the past 2 years, and she felt Margaret's sharp intake of breath beside her as the room erupted into whispered exclamations of surprise. Before the auctioneer could even acknowledge the bid, another voice cut through the murmurs. Lord Frederick Hastings rising slightly in his seat near the middle of the room to call out with pointed emphasis, £225. The declaration carried the weight of challenge rather than mere commercial interest, and Clara watched as several heads turned between the Duke and Lord Hastings with the avid attention of spectators at a sporting match. The auctioneer, clearly delighted by this unexpected turn, gestured toward Alexander with professional enthusiasm, and the Duke responded without hesitation, his tone unchanged from its original calm, £275. A collective gasp moved through the assembled crowd, and Clara heard Lady Greville's voice rise above the general noise with theatrical astonishment. Good heavens, what can possibly justify such amounts for the work of an unknown spinster? The cruelty of the phrasing, the casual dismissal wrapped in social commentary, made Clara want to sink through the floor, but she had no time to fully absorb the humiliation because Lord Hastings was speaking again, his voice now carrying an edge of irritation. £300! The figure was absurd, unprecedented, more than Clara had dared imagine her entire collection might earn together, and yet here were two of London's most prominent men engaged in what could only be termed a battle over a single piece of her work. Alexander did not even turn to acknowledge his competitor, keeping his gaze fixed forward as he stated with the same measured certainty, £350. The whispers transformed into open conversation, propriety abandoned as attendees leaned toward one another to speculate about what could possibly be motivating such extraordinary interest, whether the Duke had taken leave of his senses, or whether there was some quality to the work that others had failed to perceive. Lord Hastings stood fully now, his face flushed with what appeared to be genuine anger rather than the playful competition of gentlemen collectors, and Clara could see his jaw work before he announced £375, the words clipped and sharp. The auctioneer looked between the two men with barely concealed glee, clearly recognizing that something far beyond typical auction business was unfolding. Alexander finally turned in his seat, regarding Lord Hastings with an expression of polite inquiry that somehow conveyed complete disdain, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the now silent room. £500. The pronouncement landed with the weight of finality, a sum so excessive, so utterly beyond reasonable bounds for an emerging artist's work, that even Lord Hastings seemed momentarily struck speechless. The auctioneer waited, his gaze on Hastings with hopeful expectation, but the other man slowly resumed his seat with visible reluctance, his expression suggesting he recognized he had been outmaneuvered not merely in bid amount, but in some larger contest of will. Going once, the auctioneer called, his voice bright with satisfaction. Going twice, sold to His Grace the Duke of Ashford for £500. Clara could not breathe, could not think, could only feel Margaret's hands gripping her arm with bruising intensity as the room dissolved into chaos around them. Clara had scarcely begun to process the magnitude of what had just occurred, when the auctioneer's voice cut through the tumult once more, calling the room to order with visible effort as he announced lot number 18, another work by Miss Clara Thornhill, this one titled Morning Mist over Hampstead Heath. The painting had been among Clara's favourites of those she had submitted, a study of early light filtering through fog to illuminate the wild grasses and distant trees, and she had laboured over the layering of translucent colours to achieve that particular quality of obscured radiance. She watched in a state approaching unreality as Alexander lifted his hand almost before the auctioneer had finished speaking, his voice carrying the same unshakable certainty as before. £300 to open. The sum was staggering as a starting bid, more than most of the earlier works had achieved in total. And Clara felt the room's attention shift palpably, heads turning to observe Lord Hastings with anticipation of his response. He did not disappoint the spectators, rising again with barely suppressed fury, evident in the rigid set of his shoulders as he announced, £350, and Clara heard Lady Greville's voice pitch above the renewed whispers with acid sweetness. How extraordinary that Lord Hastings and the Duke have discovered such sudden passion for amateur landscapes. One can only wonder whether it is the art or some other factor that commands such irrational devotion. The insinuation in her tone was unmistakable, the suggestion that the competition between the men had nothing to do with artistic merit, and everything to do with masculine pride, or perhaps some charitable condescension toward a pitiable spinster, and Clara felt heat flood her face with shame, even as Margaret whispered fiercely, "She is a bitter old cat, Clara. Pay her no mind whatsoever." But Clara could not unhear the words, could not unfeel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, as Alexander countered with £425, his tone giving no indication he had heard Lady Greville's commentary, though he must surely have done. Lord Hastings was visibly struggling now, his face flushed dark with what appeared to be genuine anger rather than the sporting spirit one might expect from gentlemen collectors engaged in friendly competition. And when he called £475, there was an edge to his voice that suggested this had become personal in some way Clara could not fathom. The auctioneer looked to Alexander with barely concealed excitement, and the Duke responded without even a pause for consideration. £600, the figure so excessive that even those who had been whispering fell silent in shock. Clara felt dizzy, unmoored from reality, caught between gratitude that her work was being so valued, and humiliation that she had become the subject of such public spectacle, uncertain whether this extraordinary attention represented vindication or mockery. Lord Hastings remained standing for a long moment, his jaw working as he stared at the back of Alexander's head, before finally resuming his seat with a gesture of disgust, and the auctioneer brought his gavel down with triumphant finality. "Sold to His Grace the Duke of Ashford for £600. Margaret was speaking urgently in Clara's ear, some reassurance or exclamation, but Clara could hear nothing over the roaring in her head as she watched Alexander turn slightly in his seat, his gaze sweeping the back rows until it found her, and for one breathless moment their eyes met across the chaos of the crowded gallery before he turned forward once more. The auctioneer had barely called lot number 23 to order, a third Clara Thornhill landscape depicting twilight descending over the Thames, when Lord Hastings rose to his feet with such abruptness that his chair scraped loudly against the gallery floor, commanding immediate attention from every person in the room. He did not wait for bidding to commence, instead directing his voice toward Alexander with barely concealed contempt. "I confess myself utterly mystified by your Grace's sudden and quite extraordinary fascination with what can only be described as mediocre work at best. Surely a gentleman of your standing and education can perceive that these pleasant but ultimately unremarkable paintings possess none of the technical mastery or artistic vision that would justify such irrational expenditure." The insult landed with the force of a physical blow, and Clara felt her stomach contract with humiliation as murmurs of shock and interest rippled through the assembled crowd, every eye now fixed upon the Duke to observe his response to such public challenge. For a long moment Alexander remained seated, his posture unchanged, and Clara found herself holding her breath in the terrible silence, wishing she could simply disappear rather than remain the cause of such unseemly conflict between prominent men. Then slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone choosing his words with utmost precision, Alexander rose to his feet and turned to face not Lord Hastings but the room at large, his gaze sweeping across the assembled patrons with an authority that immediately commanded absolute silence. "Miss Thornhill's work," he began, his voice carrying clearly without any need to raise it, "demonstrates a mastery of light and atmospheric perspective that I have rarely encountered even among the most celebrated artists of our age," and Clara felt her heart begin to pound so violently she feared it might be audible to those around her. He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing with measured emphasis. Her understanding of how light transforms landscape, how it reveals and conceals, how it creates emotional resonance beyond mere representation, shows not only technical skill of the highest order, but artistic vision of profound depth. Clara could scarcely breathe as she listened to him dissect her technique with the expertise of someone who had studied her work with genuine attention, speaking of her layering of translucent colors, her composition choices, her ability to capture transient moments with permanence. The room had fallen into complete stillness. Every whispered conversation ceased, even Lady Greville silent for once as Alexander continued speaking with quiet passion about artistic merit and the failure of society to recognize talent that did not present itself through conventional channels or from expected sources. When he finally concluded with the simple statement that he considered himself fortunate to acquire work of such quality, and would continue to do so at whatever price necessary, the silence that followed felt almost sacred in its intensity. Then, as one, dozens of heads turned away from Alexander to search the back rows, seeking the woman whose work had inspired such unprecedented public defense. And Clara found herself pinned beneath the weight of countless staring eyes as Margaret's hand found hers and squeezed with fierce solidarity. The silence that followed Alexander's declaration seemed to suspend time itself, the gallery holding its collective breath as though awaiting some further revelation, when suddenly the Duke turned from facing the assembled crowd and walked with purposeful strides toward where Mrs. Louisa Fairfax stood near the auctioneer's podium, his movement creating a ripple of confusion through the room as people craned their necks to observe this unexpected disruption of auction protocol. Clara watched with the same bewilderment as everyone else as Alexander spoke quietly to Mrs. Fairfax, too low for anyone beyond their immediate vicinity to hear, and the gallery owner's face transformed through a rapid succession of expressions, starting with confusion, moving through shock, and settling finally into something approaching wonder as she nodded once, twice, then gestured for the auctioneer to join their hushed conference. The buzz of speculation began immediately, whispers building to audible conversations as the assembled patrons tried to discern what manner of negotiation could be taking place in the middle of a public auction. And Clara heard Lady Greville's voice rise above the general tumult with sharp curiosity. "What on earth can the Duke be proposing now? Surely he cannot intend to purchase every remaining piece. Even his fortune has limits." Margaret gripped Clara's hand so tightly it bordered on painful, her younger sister's face alight with barely contained excitement, though she could know no more than Clara herself what was transpiring at the front of the room. The private conference seemed to extend for an eternity, though it could not have been more than 3 or 4 minutes before Mrs. Fairfax stepped forward and raised her hands for silence, her voice trembling slightly with emotion as she announced that the auction would pause briefly as an extraordinary proposition had been presented that required her immediate consideration and response. The speculation intensified, voices calling out questions that Mrs. Fairfax ignored as she and the auctioneer withdrew to her private office with Alexander following, leaving the gallery full of bewildered and increasingly impatient patrons who began to talk among themselves with animated gestures and expressions ranging from irritation to fascination. Clara felt as though she existed outside her own body, observing the scene with a strange detachment born of emotional overload, unable to formulate coherent thoughts about what might be happening or what it might mean for her. When Mrs. Fairfax emerged some 10 minutes later, her face was flushed and her hands visibly shaking as she called for absolute silence before making an announcement that would, she said with obvious emotion, change the very nature and purpose of the gallery that had been her life's work. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, she declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the now utterly silent room, has made an offer to purchase not only all remaining works by Miss Clara Thornhill, but the gallery building itself and all its contents, with the intention of establishing it as a permanent exhibition space dedicated to emerging artists whose talents deserve greater recognition than society has yet afforded them. The gasps that greeted this pronouncement created a sound like wind through trees, and Mrs. Fairfax continued over the rising exclamations. The inaugural exhibition of this new institution will feature the complete works of Miss Thornhill, and the gallery will henceforth be known as the Thornhill Gallery, in honor of the artist whose vision inspired this transformation. The words seemed to echo and reverberate through the suddenly airless space, and for a moment the entire assembly appeared frozen in a tableau of shock, mouths agape and eyes wide with the kind of astonishment that accompanies events so far outside the boundaries of normal experience that the mind struggles to accommodate them. Then the silence shattered into chaos as voices erupted from every corner of the gallery, some exclaiming with delight at such romantic generosity, others protesting the irregularity of such a transaction, still others simply repeating the name Thornhill Gallery as though testing the sound of it against their tongues. Lady Catherine Greville sat with her mouth actually hanging open in a most unladylike fashion, her usual composure utterly destroyed by a turn of events she could never have anticipated, while beside her several other society matrons clutched at one another and whispered with furious energy. But it was Lord Frederick Hastings whose reaction commanded the most attention as he rose to his feet with such violence that his chair toppled backward with a crash that somehow carried above the general tumult. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson as he pointed an accusatory finger toward Alexander and declared in a voice shaking with rage that this was a mockery of serious collecting, a theatrical display that made a farce of artistic patronage and reduced the entire endeavor to some manner of romantic gesture unworthy of a gentleman of standing. Alexander, who had emerged from the office behind Mrs. Fairfax, regarded Lord Hastings with an expression of such perfect calm that it bordered on indifference, making no move to respond to the accusations, but simply allowing the other man's anger to spend itself against the wall of his unshakable composure. The contrast between Hastings's agitation and Alexander's stillness was so marked that several patrons actually laughed, which only intensified Hastings' fury until he sputtered something about questionable judgment and stormed toward the gallery exit with such haste that he nearly collided with a marble pedestal. As the door slammed behind him, Alexander's gaze finally moved away from where Hastings had stood and began to sweep across the assembled crowd with obvious purpose, searching, and Clara realized with a jolt of pure terror that he was looking for her. Margaret must have felt her sister stiffen because she leaned close and whispered urgently that Clara needed to breathe, actually breathe. But Clara found her lungs would not cooperate with such instructions, her entire body locked in a paralysis born of complete emotional overload. She could not process what had just occurred, could not reconcile the mundane reality of her existence mere hours ago with this present moment in which a duke had apparently purchased an entire gallery and named it after her, a woman whose greatest aspiration that morning had been that perhaps one or two of her paintings might sell for enough to pay next month's rent. The impossibility of it crashed over her in waves, each realization bringing fresh incredulity, and she became dimly aware that Margaret was now gripping both her hands and speaking to her with increasing urgency, while around them the gallery continued its chaotic response to Mrs. Fairfax's announcement, and somewhere in that swirling confusion, Alexander's searching gaze had found her at last, his expression transforming into something so tender and uncertain that Clara felt what little remained of her composure begin to crumble entirely. The gallery began to empty slowly, patrons departing in clusters that formed and reformed like eddies in a stream, their voices carrying back through the open doors as they discussed the extraordinary events they had just witnessed with the kind of animated energy that would fuel London drawing-room conversations for weeks to come. Clara remained frozen in her seat, Margaret's hand still gripping hers until she became aware of a presence approaching and looked up to find Mrs. Louisa Fairfax standing before them with an expression that mingled joy and something approaching awe. "Miss Thornhill," the gallery owner said softly, "His Grace has requested the honor of meeting you properly, if you feel able to receive him." The words seemed to come from very far away, and Clara found herself nodding, though she could not have said whether she truly felt able or simply recognized the impossibility of refusing. Margaret helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly, and together they followed Mrs. Fairfax through the thinning crowd toward where Alexander stood near the largest of Clara's paintings, the Highland landscape that had first caught his attention the previous evening. He turned as they approached, and Clara observed how his formal composure seemed to waver slightly when his eyes met hers, his hands clasping and unclasping at his sides in a gesture that spoke of nervousness utterly at odds with the commanding figure he had presented to the assembled crowd mere minutes before. Mrs. Fairfax performed the introduction with gentle formality. "Your Grace, may I present Miss Clara Thornhill, and her sister Miss Margaret Thornhill," and Clara managed a curtsy that trembled only slightly, while Margaret's was much deeper and held for a beat longer than strictly necessary. Alexander bowed in return, his voice, when he spoke, carrying a warmth that his public pronouncements had not revealed. "Miss Thornhill, I hope you will forgive the theatrical nature of this afternoon's events. I confess I had not intended quite such a public spectacle, but Lord Hastings rather forced my hand." Clara found her voice, though it emerged barely above a whisper, as she replied that she hardly knew what to say, that she could not begin to express her gratitude, or indeed fully comprehend what had transpired. He smiled then, a genuine expression that softened the aristocratic planes of his face, and asked if she might be willing to meet with him in a few days' time to discuss his plans for the gallery, emphasizing that he very much hoped to have her input and guidance as the transformation proceeded. The request was so unexpected, so far beyond the simple patronage she might have anticipated, that Clara could only nod mutely while Margaret squeezed her hand with barely suppressed excitement. Alexander's expression grew more serious as he continued, speaking with careful sincerity. "I should tell you, Miss Thornhill, that I have admired your work for some 2 years now, ever since I purchased a smaller landscape of yours through an agent. It hangs in my private study, and I find myself drawn to it daily. There is something in the quality of light you capture that speaks to experiences I had thought beyond the power of paint to convey." The 3 days between that extraordinary afternoon and the appointed meeting felt to Clara like some strange suspension of time, hours that stretched and contracted unpredictably as she oscillated between euphoric disbelief and paralyzing anxiety about what lay ahead. Margaret had thrown herself into preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, insisting that Clara's best day dress of soft grey muslin be pressed and mended where the hem had begun to fray, arranging Clara's hair in a style more fashionable than her usual simple knot, all the while chattering about what the Duke might propose and how the gallery transformation might proceed. Clara found herself unable to share her sister's unguarded excitement, too aware of how worn her best dress appeared, despite Margaret's ministrations, too conscious of the vast social gulf between herself and Alexander Pembroke, too frightened of hoping for something beyond simple professional patronage, only to discover she had wildly misinterpreted his intentions. The morning of April 19th arrived with pale spring sunshine that did nothing to calm the churning in Clara's stomach as she and Margaret made their way to the gallery, arriving precisely at the appointed hour of 10 to find Mrs. Fairfax already there and visibly delighted by the developments that had so dramatically altered her establishment's fortunes. The gallery owner had barely finished expressing her joy when the door opened to admit Alexander, who entered not with the ducal formality Clara had braced herself for, but rather with an almost boyish energy, his arms full of rolled papers that proved to be architectural plans, his greeting warm and seemingly unconscious of the way Clara's hands trembled as she returned his bow with a curtsy. He spread the plans across a table that Mrs. Fairfax hurriedly cleared, but before directing Clara's attention to the drawings, he paused and asked with genuine concern whether she was quite well, whether she needed to sit, whether she would prefer tea before they began. The unexpected solicitude threatened to undo Clara's fragile composure entirely, and she managed only a whispered assurance that she was perfectly well, though they both surely knew this to be untrue. Alexander's expression softened with something that looked remarkably like understanding as he gestured to the chairs and waited until both Clara and Margaret were seated before taking his own seat and beginning to explain his vision, speaking not with the authority of a patron dictating terms, but rather with the tentative hopefulness of someone presenting an idea he desperately wished others to embrace. The gallery, he explained, would be transformed into a permanent exhibition space dedicated to artists whose work deserved recognition, but who lacked the social connections or circumstances to gain it. A place where talent, rather than name or gender or age, would determine whose paintings graced the walls. But it was when he turned to Clara directly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult, that the true heart of his plan emerged, for he confessed that while he envisioned the gallery serving many artists over the years to come, it was her work specifically that had inspired the entire endeavour. The working relationship that developed over the following weeks transformed from formal obligation into something altogether unexpected, as the weekly meetings initially scheduled to discuss paint colours and wall arrangements gradually expanded to encompass conversations that ranged far beyond the practical necessities of gallery renovation. By late April, Clara found herself anticipating their appointments with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her, arriving at the gallery to find Alexander already there more often than not, his face lighting with genuine pleasure when she entered in a way that made her heart perform acrobatics she had thought herself too sensible to experience. They would begin with dutiful attention to the architect's latest modifications, or Mrs. Fairfax's questions about exhibition scheduling, but inevitably the discussions would drift toward broader territories, debates about whether landscape painting could achieve the emotional depth of portraiture, explorations of how light itself could serve as subject rather than mere illumination, exchanges that revealed the considerable thought each had devoted to questions the other had believed interested no one but themselves. It was during one such conversation in early May, as they stood before her Highland landscape, discussing the particular quality of dawn light on granite, that Alexander revealed something of his own history, with a hesitancy that suggested the confidence of his public persona, concealed private wounds not unlike Clara's own. He spoke of his father's dismissal of his interest in art as frivolous affectation, unsuitable for a future duke, of years spent pretending indifference to beauty while secretly studying technique and composition, of the relief and loneliness that had come with his inheritance 5 years prior, when he finally possessed the freedom to pursue his passions, but found himself isolated by a title that made genuine connection nearly impossible. Clara listened with growing recognition, seeing in his careful words an echo of her own experience of dismissal, and found herself responding with unusual openness about her father's death, about the terror and strange liberation of realizing she must support herself and Margaret through her painting, about the slow erosion of hope as year after year her work was praised as charming but ultimately forgettable. The conversation left them both quieter than usual, but it was a comfortable quiet, the silence of two people who had unexpectedly discovered they spoke the same language beneath the different dialects their circumstances had taught them. As May progressed and the gallery transformation accelerated, Clara became aware that she was learning to see past the ducal formality that Alexander wore like armor in public, catching glimpses of the perceptive and somewhat lonely man who existed beneath the title, a man who studied her paintings with the intensity of someone seeking in them something he had lost or perhaps never possessed, who asked her opinion not with patronizing courtesy, but with genuine interest in her perspective, who seemed to value her company for reasons that had nothing to do with charity or social obligation, and everything to do with some quality in herself she had never imagined anyone might treasure. The shift began so subtly that Clara could not identify its precise origin, but by mid-May she became gradually aware that the easy warmth of her weekly meetings with Alexander was being poisoned by whispers that seemed to follow her through London streets and markets like an unwelcome shadow. Margaret brought home the first explicit evidence one afternoon in the 3rd week of May, her young face troubled as she reported that Lady Catherine Greville had been holding court at the modiste's shop, loudly speculating about the inappropriate familiarity between a certain impoverished spinster artist and her noble patron, suggesting with arched eyebrows and significant pauses that Clara Thornhill had perhaps employed arts other than painting to secure the Duke of Ashford's extraordinary generosity. The words struck Clara like physical blows, all the more painful for containing echoes of doubts she had tried desperately to silence in her own mind, and she found herself lying awake that night, cataloguing every conversation with Alexander, every moment of easy laughter or comfortable silence, wondering with creeping horror whether she had indeed been inappropriate, whether her growing feelings for him had somehow become visible to observers, whether she had committed the unforgivable error of mistaking patronage for genuine regard. The doubt, once admitted, spread through her thoughts like ink through water, staining everything. And when she arrived at the gallery for their next scheduled meeting, she found herself unable to recapture the natural warmth that had developed between them, retreating instead into stiff formality, addressing him as "Your Grace" with every response, maintaining physical distance, deflecting any attempt at personal conversation back to the safer territory of paint colors and exhibition schedules. Alexander noticed the change immediately. She could see it in the way his expression shifted from welcoming warmth to confusion, the way his sentences began to falter mid-thought, as though he were trying to identify what had altered in the atmosphere between them. And finally, he set down the fabric samples they had been ostensibly discussing and asked with careful gentleness whether he had done something to offend her, whether she would prefer to postpone their meetings, whether she wished for Mrs. Fairfax to serve as chaperone during their discussions. The kindness in his questions made everything worse somehow, and Clara found herself unable to meet his eyes as she deflected his concern with words about propriety and mindfulness of appearances, assurances that she simply wished to maintain appropriate professional boundaries given the generosity he had shown her and the gallery. She could see that her explanation satisfied nothing, that Alexander remained troubled and confused, but he accepted her words with the courtesy that characterized all his interactions, though something in his grey eyes suggested hurt beneath the ducal composure. And when they parted that afternoon, Clara felt as though she had damaged something precious through her cowardice, unable to articulate the truth that she was protecting not propriety, but her own heart, terrified of the growing hope she felt in his presence, and convinced that Lady Greville's cruel speculation would prove prophetic, that she had indeed wildly misread friendly patronage as something infinitely more valuable and infinitely less likely. The gallery transformation accelerated through the final weeks of May and into early June, and despite the strained formality that had settled between them like unwelcome frost, Clara could not deny the extraordinary care Alexander had devoted to every detail of the space that would bear her name, though she remained unaware of this final particular until the afternoon of June 7th, when he sent a message requesting she meet him at the gallery for a matter requiring her immediate attention. She arrived with Margaret in tow as chaperone, a concession to the whispers that still followed her through London's streets, and found Alexander standing in the gallery's main room, surrounded by the organized chaos of final preparations, painters touching up crown moulding, craftsmen installing the last of the brass fixtures, the smell of fresh varnish and beeswax polish, thick in the afternoon air, filtering through tall windows now fitted with new glass that made the space luminous. He greeted them with the careful courtesy that had replaced their earlier ease, but Clara detected something beneath his formal welcome, a tension in the set of his shoulders that suggested nervousness entirely uncharacteristic of a duke accustomed to command. And when he asked Margaret with apologetic politeness if she might excuse them for a brief private conversation, promising to leave the door open for propriety's sake, Clara felt her heart accelerate with mingled hope and dread. He led her to the gallery's entrance, where a large rectangular object stood covered by canvas dropcloth, and turned to face her with an expression that managed to combine determination and uncertainty in equal measure, before explaining that he had something to show her, something he hoped she would accept, but would understand if she refused. And with that cryptic preamble, he drew away the cloth to reveal an elegant sign of carved wood with gold lettering that read, "The Thornhill Gallery," in script so beautiful it seemed to transform her ordinary surname into something remarkable. Clara stared at the sign, feeling the gallery tilt around her, her first coherent thought being that there must be some mistake, that he could not possibly intend to attach her name to an establishment of such ambition and significance. And she heard herself protesting even as tears began to blur the golden letters, arguing that she did not deserve such honor, that her work was not sufficiently accomplished to justify such recognition, that people would mock the presumption of a spinster artist having a gallery named in her honor when far more talented painters remained unknown. Alexander listened to her cascade of objections with an expression that shifted from hopeful anticipation to something harder, a tightness around his mouth that Clara had never seen before. And when she finally fell silent, breathless with distress, he asked with a quiet intensity that carried an edge almost like anger, why she could not see what he saw, why she insisted on viewing herself through the cruel lens of people whose judgment was worth nothing, why she refused to accept that her work possessed genuine merit and her person genuine value beyond the arbitrary measures society applied to women of limited fortune and unmarried state. The question hung in the air between them, charged with an intensity that transformed the familiar gallery into unfamiliar territory, and Clara found herself unable to look away from Alexander's face, where frustration and something deeper, something almost like pain, had displaced his customary ducal composure, making him appear younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, despite his 34 years and all the authority his title conferred. She opened her mouth to offer some deflecting response, some polite dismissal that would restore the safe distance she had been trying so desperately to maintain. But the words that emerged surprised her with their raw honesty, as she heard herself explaining in a voice that trembled despite her efforts at control that she had been taught since girlhood to measure her worth by the standards society applied, that at 28 and unmarried, she had long since accepted her status as a woman who had missed her opportunity for the life she might have wanted, that her family's reduced circumstances following her father's death had placed her beyond the consideration of respectable suitors, that her determination to support herself and Margaret through painting had marked her as unfeminine and grasping in the eyes of people like Lady Greville, whose opinions shaped London society's judgments. The confession gained momentum as years of internalized dismissal poured forth, and she found herself cataloguing all the reasons she had learned not to hope for recognition or regard, the whispered comments about spinsters who refused to accept their lot, the pitying looks from married women secure in their positions, the casual cruelty of men who treated unmarried women past 25 as invisible creatures unworthy of consideration, the art critics who praised her technical skill while dismissing her subjects as charmingly feminine, but lacking the gravitas of masculine vision. Alexander listened without interruption, but she could see the tightness around his mouth intensifying, a muscle working in his jaw as though he were physically restraining some powerful response. And when she finally fell silent, exhausted by the weight of articulated pain she had carried unspoken for so long, he stepped closer with such sudden intensity that she instinctively drew back until the wall prevented further retreat. His voice when he spoke carried a force she had never heard from him, all ducal politeness stripped away to reveal something fierce and uncompromising, as he declared that society's judgment was worthless, that the opinions of people who measured human value by fortune and marital status and arbitrary timelines deserved nothing but contempt, that her art moved him more profoundly than any work he had encountered in 15 years of serious collecting, that her perspective was rare and valuable precisely because she had known dismissal and limitation, that she possessed a quality of genuine perception entirely absent from the privileged masses who thought themselves her superiors. He was close enough now that she could see the grey flecks in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him, and he lifted one hand as though to touch her face before catching himself and letting it fall. But not before she had seen in that aborted gesture something that made her heart stutter with terrified hope, and she thought he might say something more, something that would shatter the last of her carefully maintained defences, when the gallery door opened with a crash, and Mrs. Fairfax rushed in, breathless with apologies and urgent news about a problem with the gaslighting installation that required the Duke's immediate attention. The following 3 days passed in a fog of avoidance, as Clara found reasons not to visit the gallery, sending Margaret in her stead with messages about being occupied with completing a commission or attending to household matters, excuses that grew thinner with each repetition, until even she could hear the transparent evasion in them. Margaret returned from each errand with increasingly pointed looks, and finally on the evening of June 10th, confronted Clara in their modest sitting room where she had been pretending to sketch while actually staring at blank paper for the better part of an hour, and her sister settled onto the worn sofa with the determined expression that meant she would not be dismissed with vague reassurances. "You are being foolish," Margaret declared without preamble, her 24 years lending her a directness that Clara simultaneously appreciated and resented. And when Clara attempted to protest that she was simply being prudent, Margaret made an unladylike sound of dismissal that would have shocked their late mother. "The Duke clearly cares for you beyond any professional interest," Margaret continued, and Clara felt her hands begin to tremble around her pencil as her sister articulated the hope she had been desperately trying not to acknowledge. "He looks at you as though you are the only person in any room." Margaret pressed on. "He solicits your opinion on matters where his own expertise far exceeds yours. he defends you to people whose good opinion most men of his rank would court. And when Mrs. Fairfax interrupted you both 3 days ago, she said his expression was that of a man who had lost something precious. So whatever conversation you were having before she entered clearly mattered a great deal to him." Clara set down her pencil with careful precision, and heard herself confessing in a voice barely above a whisper that she was terrified, that allowing herself to hope for something beyond professional patronage felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, preparing to step into empty air, that she could not bear to be wrong about what she thought she had seen in Alexander's eyes, because being wrong would hurt more than all the years of casual dismissal she had already endured. Margaret crossed to kneel beside Clara's chair and took her hands with fierce gentleness, asking what would hurt more, the possibility of pain or the certainty of never knowing, and Clara had no answer that did not sound like cowardice. The following morning a messenger arrived bearing a cream envelope sealed with the Ashford crest, and Clara's hands shook as she broke the wax to find a formal invitation written in Alexander's own hand, rather than a secretary's precise script, requesting the honour of Miss Clara Thornhill's presence at the opening gala of the Thornhill Gallery on the evening of June 28th as guest of honour, and beneath the formal language was a postscript in smaller writing that read simply, "I hope you will come." And she read those 5 words over and over until Margaret gently took the letter from her trembling fingers and declared that they would need to commission a new gown immediately. The evening of June 28th arrived with unseasonable warmth that carried the scent of roses through London's streets, and Clara stood before the mirror in their modest rooms feeling like an impostor in the deep blue silk gown that Margaret had insisted they commission, despite the expense, the fabric shimmering in the lamplight and cut in the latest fashion with short sleeves and a neckline that felt daringly low to someone accustomed to wearing her oldest day dresses while working at her easel. Margaret fussed with Clara's hair, where the maid had arranged it in an elegant style that showed her neck, tucking in flowers that matched the gown, and Clara caught her sister's reflection in the mirror, where excitement and satisfaction warred with something tender that looked almost like pride. "You look beautiful," Margaret declared with fierce conviction, and Clara wanted to protest that beauty had never been among her limited assets. But the truth was that she barely recognized the woman looking back at her, not because the gown and hairstyle had transformed her features, but because something in her expression had shifted during the weeks of working with Alexander, some subtle relaxation of the resigned tension she had carried for so long. The hired carriage delivered them to the gallery as dusk settled over the city, and Clara's breath caught at the sight of the transformed building where gaslight blazed from every window and well-dressed figures moved through rooms she had come to know in their bare, unfinished state. Margaret squeezed her hand as they entered to find the gallery filled with what seemed like half of London society, women in jewels and silk moving between paintings that Clara had created in solitude and occasional despair, their voices a hum of conversation that rose toward the newly plastered ceiling where chandeliers cast light that seemed almost too bright after months of seeing these spaces dim and dusty. Mrs. Fairfax appeared immediately to greet them with warmth that Clara suspected exceeded what she showed to patrons of higher rank, guiding them through the crowd while pointing out various notable attendees, and Clara registered the stares that followed their progress, some faces showing genuine interest in the artist behind the work, while others wore the calculating expressions of people trying to understand what advantage might be gained from acknowledging her. Lady Greville stood near Clara's largest Highland landscape holding court among a cluster of similarly dressed women, and though her words did not carry across the room, the sidelong glance she directed toward Clara, combined with the smiles of her companions, made clear that whatever commentary she was providing did not err on the side of generosity. Then Alexander was there, moving through the crowd with unconscious authority that made space appear before him, and his eyes found Clara with an intensity that made her forget the watching masses, his formal evening clothes and ducal bearing somehow emphasizing, rather than hiding, the man she had come to know through their long conversations about art and meaning and the various forms of loneliness that privilege could not prevent. And when he reached her side and bowed over her hand with lips that brushed her glove for just a moment longer than strict propriety demanded, she heard the whispers intensify around them like wind through autumn leaves. Alexander's voice carried across the gallery with the natural authority of a man accustomed to being heard as he raised his glass and called for attention, and the hum of conversation gradually subsided until perhaps 80 faces turned toward where he stood near the largest of Clara's paintings, with Clara herself positioned slightly to his side, where she could observe both him and the assembled crowd. He began by thanking everyone for attending the inaugural exhibition of the Thornhill Gallery, and spoke of his vision for the space as a haven for artists whose work deserved recognition, regardless of whether they possessed the connections or circumstances that typically granted access to London's established art world. And Clara heard genuine passion in his words as he described his hope that this gallery might become a place where talent alone determined whose work graced these walls. Then his gaze shifted to her with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of every person watching, and he spoke her name with a reverence that felt almost unbearable as he declared that Miss Clara Thornhill's extraordinary gift for capturing not merely the physical beauty of the natural world, but the emotional truth contained within landscape and light had inspired this entire endeavor, that her technical mastery combined with profound sensitivity created work that moved him in ways he had rarely experienced, and that he considered it the greatest privilege to feature her paintings in this inaugural exhibition. The room remained silent in a way that felt precarious, and Alexander concluded by expressing his hope that others would see in her work what he saw, genius that had been overlooked for far too long, and he raised his glass in a toast to Clara Thornhill and to all artists whose worth exceeded society's limited capacity to recognize it. Applause followed, some enthusiastic and some merely polite, and Clara felt every eye upon her as Alexander turned with an expression that managed to be both encouraging and gently insistent, indicating that she should respond with words of her own. Her throat felt impossibly tight as she stepped forward on legs that trembled beneath the blue silk, and she managed to say in a voice that started soft but grew steadier that she was honored beyond measure by the Duke's generosity and faith in her work, that she had painted for years in solitude without expectation of recognition, and that to see her paintings displayed in such beauty, surrounded by people willing to look at them, felt like a dream she had not dared to have. She intended to conclude there, but found herself adding that creating art had been her way of making sense of a world that often felt incomprehensible, and if her paintings moved even one person the way the Duke suggested they had moved him, then every hour spent perfecting the play of light on water or the precise shade of a winter sky had been worthwhile. The applause that followed felt warmer than before, and Clara allowed herself a small breath of relief until Lord Hastings' voice cut across the room from where he stood near the entrance with a glass of wine in hand and an expression of calculated malice, declaring loudly enough for all to hear that one had to wonder whether His Grace's judgment regarding Miss Thornhill's work was influenced by artistic merit alone or by other factors that gentlemen did not typically discuss in mixed company, and the room went utterly silent, as shock rippled through the crowd at such a blatant insinuation. Alexander's expression transformed in an instant, from warmth to something cold and dangerous that Clara had never seen before, and he moved toward Hastings with controlled precision that made several guests step quickly aside, as though sensing the shift in atmosphere from celebration to confrontation. "Lord Hastings," Alexander said in a voice that carried to every corner of the gallery despite its measured tone, I will ask you once to retract that statement and apologize to Miss Thornhill for the insult you have just delivered to her character and reputation." Hastings' face flushed with wine and what looked like vindictive satisfaction as he replied that he had merely observed what half of London was already thinking, that a duke did not purchase an entire gallery for an unmarried woman of no particular family or beauty unless he expected some form of compensation beyond artistic gratitude. The sharp intake of breath from multiple guests created a sound like wind through the gallery, and Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the ugly insinuation hung in the air where everyone could examine it. Alexander took another step toward Hastings with his hands clenched at his sides, and his voice, when he spoke again, had dropped to something quietly lethal as he stated that Hastings had just slandered a lady of impeccable character whose only crime was possessing talent that exceeded Hastings' limited capacity to recognize it, and that if Hastings possessed an ounce of honor, he would leave immediately before Alexander felt compelled to seek satisfaction for the insult in a manner that society would find regrettable. Before Hastings could respond, a voice spoke from near the Highland landscape, where an elderly gentleman with an artist's stained fingers stepped forward and declared that he was Thomas Weatherby of the Royal Academy, and that he had examined Miss Thornhill's work earlier this evening and found it to be of exceptional quality, demonstrating technical mastery and artistic vision that would do credit to any painter regardless of sex, and that the Duke's recognition of her talent spoke well of his judgment rather than poorly of his character. Another voice joined from across the room, where a woman in elegant grey silk identified herself as Mrs. Adelaide Norton, patroness of several established artists, and stated that she had been considering which piece to purchase this evening, and had settled on Miss Thornhill's study of Morning Light on the Thames because it moved her profoundly, and she resented Lord Hastings' implication that appreciation of genuine artistry must be motivated by base considerations. Then more voices rose in a chorus that seemed to surprise even those speaking, other artists and collectors stepping forward to defend either Clara's work or Alexander's character or both, and Lady Greville remained silent near the wall with an expression suggesting calculation about which direction social opinion was flowing. Hastings looked around at the gathering opposition with shock giving way to anger, and he declared that they were all fools taken in by sentiment, but his voice lacked conviction, and several people had turned their backs in the cut direct that society reserved for those who had violated its codes past forgiveness. Alexander spoke once more with finality, stating that Lord Hastings was no longer welcome in the Thornhill Gallery, and that if he did not leave immediately, Alexander would have him removed, and after a moment of tense silence, Hastings turned on his heel and strode toward the exit with what dignity he could salvage, while the assembled guests watched his retreat. Clara stood frozen throughout the entire confrontation, with her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy, and as the gallery slowly returned to conversation and movement, she understood with stunning clarity that Alexander had just risked social consequence and potential scandal to defend her honor before the very society whose judgment she had always feared, and that such a public declaration of faith in her worth could not be merely about patronage or even friendship, but must indicate something deeper that both terrified and illuminated her like sudden sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The guests began departing in clusters as the evening drew toward midnight, their voices carrying speculation and scandal in equal measure as they filtered out into the summer darkness, and Alexander moved through the thinning crowd with polite farewells until he reached where Clara stood with Margaret near the painting of autumn in the countryside, with its golden light that now seemed prophetic of transformation. He spoke quietly to Margaret first, thanking her for attending, and noting that he hoped to speak with Clara privately about some gallery matters, if she would be comfortable waiting, or perhaps returning home with the assurance that he would see Clara safely back within the hour. Margaret's expression suggested she understood perfectly well that gallery matters were not the true subject of discussion, and she squeezed Clara's hand with encouragement before accepting the offer of Alexander's carriage for her journey home, leaving Clara alone with the Duke in the gas-lit gallery, surrounded by her own work and the lingering scent of roses from the arrangements that had decorated the space. Alexander stood silent for a moment as though gathering words, then gestured toward the paintings and suggested they walk through the gallery together, now that it belonged only to them and the quiet. And Clara fell into step beside him, with her heart beating hard enough that she feared he might hear it in the stillness. They moved slowly past each landscape, and Alexander paused before the Highland scene that had first caught his attention at the preview months ago, the one that had started everything, and he said softly that he had not been entirely truthful earlier when he claimed to have admired her work for 2 years. Clara felt confusion and something like disappointment until he continued, explaining that the truth was he had purchased his first Clara Thornhill painting 3 years ago from a small shop in Edinburgh where it had been displayed without fanfare, a study of dawn breaking over mountains that he had encountered during a period of profound personal difficulty following his father's death, and the sudden weight of responsibilities he had never wanted. His voice carried emotion he seemed unused to expressing as he described standing before that painting and feeling something shift inside him, the way her depiction of light pushing back darkness had moved him to tears in a dusty shop where the proprietor had seemed baffled by his intensity, and he had purchased it immediately and carried it back to London, where it hung in his private chambers where only he could see it. He turned to look at Clara directly with an expression that held vulnerability she had never seen in a man of his position, and he said that her art had been a companion through his loneliness in ways he struggled to articulate, that returning to that painting after difficult days or empty social obligations had reminded him that beauty and meaning existed beyond duty and expectation, and that when he had learned there would be more of her work at auction, he had attended with every intention of acquiring whatever was available. Then his voice dropped lower as he added that meeting her, knowing her, had transformed what began as profound appreciation into something far more personal, and that she had become as essential to him as her art had been, perhaps more so because she was the source of all that beauty and perception that had sustained him through darkness. Clara felt something breaking open inside her chest, like ice that had frozen around her heart for years, suddenly cracking under unexpected warmth, and the words came spilling out before she could stop them or shape them into something more dignified, her voice trembling as she said that she had been afraid from the moment she first saw him studying her painting, because she recognized even then that he saw what no one else had bothered to look for, and that recognition had been more terrifying than dismissal, because it meant hope was possible, and hope had always led to disappointment. She turned away from his intense gaze to face the painting of morning light on water, the one she had created during a particularly lonely winter when Margaret had been ill and money desperately short, and the future had seemed like nothing but grey repetition. And she confessed that she had taught herself not to want things beyond survival and her sister's welfare, because wanting anything more had seemed like inviting pain that she could not afford to feel. Her hands twisted together as she admitted that watching him at the auction, seeing him bid against Hastings, hearing him speak about her work with such conviction, had awakened every suppressed longing she had buried under resignation, and she had been terrified that she was misunderstanding, that his interest was merely that of a collector toward an object of curiosity, that she would build hope only to discover it was founded on nothing more substantial than her own desperate imagination. Alexander moved to stand beside her before the painting, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool gallery air, and his voice when he spoke held frustration mixed with tenderness as he asked what he must do to make her believe in her own worth, What proof he could possibly offer beyond what he had already given, whether purchasing a gallery and defending her honor before society and confessing his dependence on her art and her presence was insufficient evidence of his sincerity. Clara felt tears burning in her eyes as she turned to face him and said that the difficulty was not believing in his sincerity, but in believing that she deserved it, that 28 years of being taught she was unremarkable, too old, too plain, too poor, too ambitious in unfeminine ways, had built walls inside her that could not be torn down simply because one man, even a duke, even him, saw something different. She watched his expression shift through frustration to something like anguish, and he reached out slowly, as though giving her time to retreat, and when she did not move, he took both her hands in his with a gentleness that made her throat tighten, and he said her name like a question and a declaration together. Clara, just her name with all the weight of everything unspoken in the two syllables. He asked if she could imagine, not believe yet, but simply imagine, a life where she was valued as she deserved, where her art was celebrated rather than tolerated, where she woke each morning knowing she was seen and treasured, not despite who she was, but because of it, and whether she could imagine that life including him not as patron or benefactor, but as partner and husband, and the man who loved her more than he had thought himself capable of loving anyone. The word love fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Clara thought she understood about her life and her place in the world. And Alexander's voice, when he spoke it again, held nothing of aristocratic reserve, but only raw honesty, as he said that he loved her, that he had loved her first through her paintings when they were all he had of her inner world, and now loved her more completely through knowing the woman who created such beauty from observation and feeling. He said he had never intended to fall in love with anyone because his position had taught him that most people saw only his title and his wealth and the doors he could open rather than the man who grew weary of performance and longed for genuine connection, but that Clara had never looked at him with calculation or social ambition, had seemed if anything almost afraid of his attention in ways that made him want to prove himself worthy of her trust. His hands tightened around hers as he said that if she would have him, he wanted to marry her not to rescue her from reduced circumstances or to acquire her as one might acquire a painting, but because she had become necessary to his happiness in ways he had not known were possible, because conversation with her fed something in him that had been starving, because her way of seeing the world had taught him to look at his own life differently. He released one of her hands to gesture at the gallery surrounding them and said that all of this, the building and the public honor and the defense of her work, was not charity or even patronage, but selfishness on his part, because he could not bear the thought of her talent remaining hidden, could not tolerate society continuing to overlook what he found extraordinary, and he wanted the world to see her as he did, even though he would prefer to keep her entirely to himself, if such a thing were possible. Then his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper as he asked her directly, "Clara Thornhill, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Of allowing me to support your continued work as an artist, of building a life together where you need never doubt your worth or your place, or whether you are seen and treasured?" Clara felt the tears that had been burning behind her eyes finally spill over and track down her cheeks, and she realized she was trembling, not with fear now, but with the overwhelming force of years of resignation suddenly cracking apart under the weight of being loved, truly loved, by a man who saw past every limitation society had tried to impose on her. Her voice, when she found it, was unsteady and thick with emotion as she said his name, Alexander, and watched his expression shift from vulnerable hope to something almost like fear as he waited for her answer. And she understood in that moment that he was as afraid of her rejection as she had been of his indifference, that somehow, despite everything separating them, in worldly terms, they stood before each other as equals in their need and their hope. She said yes, and the word came out as barely more than a whisper at first, choked with tears and wonder, and then again stronger. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. And she watched his expression transform from fearful hope to joy so pure and unguarded that it made him look younger than his 34 years, made him look like a man who had been holding his breath and could finally exhale. He pulled her closer with a sound that was half laugh and half something deeper, and then his hand came up to cup her face with such tenderness that Clara felt her breath catch, his thumb brushing away the tears on her cheek as he asked permission with his eyes before closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle and questioning, a tentative exploration that tasted of salt from her tears and felt like a promise being sealed. And Clara, who had never been kissed, who had resigned herself to never knowing this particular intimacy, felt something bloom inside her chest that was part joy and part grief for all the years she had believed this impossible. Alexander kissed her again with more certainty, his other hand moving to her waist to steady them both. And Clara let herself lean into him and kiss him back with all the feeling she had been afraid to acknowledge, let herself be held and wanted and loved in ways that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. When they finally drew apart, they were both breathing unsteadily, and Alexander rested his forehead against hers and said her name like a prayer, Clara, my Clara, and asked when they might marry, because he found he had no patience for long engagements now that she had agreed to be his. They moved to one of the benches positioned before her paintings and sat close together, his arm around her shoulders, and her head resting against him in a way that would have been scandalous if anyone could see them, and they spoke in quiet voices about the future they would build together. Alexander described his estate in the country with its extensive grounds and the room with northern light that he had been imagining as her studio since before he ever dared hope she might agree to marry him. And Clara felt tears threaten again at the realization that he had been planning for her happiness, even when the outcome was uncertain. She told him about her dreams for her work, subjects she had never attempted because they required time and resources she lacked, and he listened with complete attention and made suggestions that showed he understood not just her art, but her artistic vision. They were deep in conversation about whether September would allow enough time for proper arrangements when the gallery door opened and Margaret's voice called out tentatively, asking if Clara was still there, and they pulled apart quickly, though not quickly enough to hide what had clearly been happening. Margaret took one look at their faces, at Clara's tear-stained joy and Alexander's protective posture, and let out a small shriek of delight before rushing forward to embrace her sister and demand to know everything. Clara laughed through fresh tears as she told Margaret about the proposal and her acceptance, and watched her sister's face light with such genuine happiness that it erased any lingering doubt about whether this was real or sustainable. They were married on the 14th of August in 1823, in a ceremony that managed to be both elegant and intimate, held in the chapel on Alexander's estate, with its stone walls softened by late summer light filtering through stained glass windows that painted the floor in jewel tones of amber and sapphire and rose. Clara wore ivory silk that Margaret had helped her choose, simpler than fashion dictated, but beautiful in its clean lines, and the way it made her look like herself, rather than a costume version of a bride. And she carried wildflowers from the estate gardens that Alexander had insisted on, because he said hothouse roses seemed too formal for what he felt. The guest list was small by ducal standards, perhaps 50 people including Margaret, who served as Clara's attendant, and wept happily through the entire ceremony. Mrs. Fairfax, who had become something of a friend through the gallery preparations and a selection of Alexander's family and Clara's few remaining relations, who seemed stunned to find themselves at a duke's wedding. Lady Catherine Greville was in attendance because social necessity demanded it, and Clara watched the woman's face during the ceremony and saw the tight expression of someone forced to acknowledge what she had dismissed, forced to curtsy to the new Duchess of Ashford, who had been beneath her notice mere months ago. Lord Hastings had not been invited, and his absence felt like a blessing, one source of tension removed from a day that Clara wanted to remember only for joy. Alexander's voice when he spoke his vows was steady and clear, his eyes never leaving Clara's face as he promised to honor and cherish her for all the days of his life. And when it was Clara's turn, she felt her voice shake only slightly as she promised the same, and meant it with an intensity that still surprised her. The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief and chaste given the audience, but Clara felt the promise in it, the tenderness and the barely restrained passion that would have privacy to express itself later. The wedding breakfast was held in the estate's great hall with its high ceilings and portraits of Alexander's ancestors looking down on the unlikely addition to their family line, and Clara sat beside her new husband at the head table and felt the surreal quality of her changed circumstances, the way people now approached her with deference rather than dismissal. The toast that moved her most came not from family, but from Mrs. Fairfax, who spoke about Clara's talent and perseverance and said that the art world was better for the Duke's recognition of what had been there all along, waiting to be seen. After the meal, Alexander led Clara outside to the gardens and presented her with his wedding gift, taking her hand and walking her to what she had thought was a groundskeeper's building, but which had been completely transformed. The studio he had built for her featured north-facing windows that filled the space with perfect clear light, walls painted white to maximize the brightness, and everything an artist could need from easels to pigments to canvas already organized and waiting. Clara stood in the doorway unable to speak as tears blurred her vision, and Alexander came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and asked quietly if it would suit. And she turned in his embrace and kissed him, and said it was perfect, everything was perfect, he was perfect, and she still could not quite believe this was her life now. 2 years had passed since that August wedding, and Clara stood in the Thornhill Gallery on a crisp October afternoon in 1825, her infant daughter Margaret sleeping peacefully in her arms, while all around them visitors moved quietly through the exhibition space, admiring the work of a young landscape artist from Cornwall whose seascapes had reminded Clara of her own early struggles to capture light on canvas. The gallery had featured 4 artists since its opening, and had become known throughout London as a place where genuine talent could be recognized regardless of the artist's social standing or circumstances, and Clara felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that what Alexander had begun in her honor was now changing lives beyond her own. Her own work had continued and deepened in these 2 years of marriage, the paintings she produced now carrying a confidence and emotional complexity that came from finally believing in her own vision, and Alexander remained her first viewer and most trusted critic, coming to her studio each evening to see what progress she had made and offering observations that showed his understanding of what she was attempting. The studio he had built for her had become her sanctuary, a space where she could work for hours with little Margaret sleeping in a cradle nearby and light pouring through those perfect north-facing windows. And she had completed 12 new paintings in the past year, including a series on motherhood that several critics had called her finest work. Lady Catherine Greville now curtsied to the Duchess of Ashford at social events and spoke with careful respect about Clara's artistic achievements. And while Clara took no particular pleasure in the woman's discomfort, she did feel a quiet vindication in the transformation of her social position from dismissed spinster to honored duchess and respected artist. Lord Hastings had left London for his country estate and was rarely seen in society. His name mentioned only occasionally and usually with a dismissive tone, while Alexander's reputation as a discerning patron had only grown as the gallery's success proved the soundness of his judgment. Clara adjusted her sleeping daughter's blanket and moved to stand before one of her own paintings that hung in a place of honour near the gallery entrance. A landscape of the Scottish Highlands at dawn that Alexander had refused to sell despite numerous offers because he said it was the painting that had first shown him who Clara truly was. She thought about that night 2 years ago when she had stood in the shadows of this same space, believing herself invisible and unremarkable, resigned to a life on the margins. And she marveled at how completely everything had changed, not because she had become someone different, but because someone had finally seen who she had always been. Perhaps you know something of that feeling, of being overlooked or dismissed, of believing the limitations others place upon you, of thinking it is too late for transformation or recognition or love. And if you do, then hear this truth that Clara learned in that gallery amid the gaslight and the bidding war and the extraordinary gesture that changed her life. Your worth exists whether others recognize it or not. Your gifts have value whether the world has acknowledged them yet, and it is never too late for someone to truly see you and for your life to open into possibilities you had ceased to imagine. So hold fast to hope even in the seasons of invisibility, because recognition may be closer than you know, and love may be waiting just beyond the next corner, ready to rename the gallery of your life and fill it with light.